Hi, I'm Valerie Engelhart, and in this video I am going to demonstrate how I paint a loose elephant head on hot press paper on a small size 4x6. And so you can see exactly how quickly or slowly I paint. I'm keeping this video at just regular speed. I usually speed these up a bit for viewing pleasure, but sometimes it's really nice just to watch the paint bloom in real time. And speaking of paint, I am using 4 colors, although I will pull out some white gouache later. But the colors I am using are Winsor & Newton's Winsor Red Deep, that's the first color I put on. Some Daniel Smith Quinacridone Gold. It is one of my must-have colors and it brings radiant light into any piece. I've also got some Daniel Smith Red Fuchsite Genuine, and I picked that one because I want some sparkle. And then for shadows and granulation, I have some Bloodstone Genuine, which almost looks like a dark black brown, but it has warmer tones to it, and Bloodstone Genuine really granulates. It creates amazing textures. Now with pretty much all of my paintings, I don't sketch first. So off on the side, I have a reference image that I have made black and white and isolated into 3 values, which is white, gray, and black. That way I can just focus on shapes and how dark something is versus trying to get colors correct. Plus, I'm painting an elephant in red. I'm certainly not going for realism here. I do have this small block of paper up at an angle, and that way when I put paint on, it drips downwards. Now, one way I challenged myself on this piece was leaving that white space on each lower side. I have a tendency to not like hard edges and will smooth everything out, but I didn't want to do that with this piece. I'm using super hot colors, very bold and eye-catching, and so leaving those hard lines there, while at first it was really bugging me, not because it doesn't look good, but just because it's against what I usually do, but I'm glad I did. And sometimes using just these small pieces of paper are fantastic for letting yourself do these things that you don't normally do, because if it's a loss, well, it's just a small piece of paper. Now, even though this is just the first layer, it's the first wash, look at that Bloodstone Genuine, how it's granulating and moving. It looks so organic. And I'm dropping it into shadow areas of my elephant, so around the eye, the folds in the ear, and I'm paying attention to where I want my light. So the left side has more of the gold and the right side has the Bloodstone Genuine. But I do want to bring that Bloodstone Genuine into the other side because then otherwise things are disconnected. I want cohesion, but I want to be playful with it. And just because an area is black doesn't mean I have to use the darkest color. It just means use a dark value. So in some of these areas, I went in really deep with the Winsor Red Deep because that worked for creating form. And already I can see an elephant emerging. So look at that giant drop down at the bottom of the trunk. I could leave it and get a bloom, but I decided against it, so I pulled a paper towel and I'm just lightly dabbing off the bottom. And because the Bloodstone Genuine is such a granulating color, down at the bottom that sediment was sitting. And I didn't know that I really wanted it sitting down at the very bottom of the trunk, so I did just lightly tap that away, but I did like the sediment in kind of those other pockets. It shows off the quality of that paint. And it's nothing that I can plan. It happens all by itself, just add water. So now that the first layer is dry, which I had to allow to dry naturally, you don't want to take a blow dryer to this because it's going to blow the pigment everywhere and you won't get a chance to make those natural granulating marks or any of those watercolor blooms. And so I've got my liner brush now, and I'm just finding marks that are naturally created in my piece and building out. So some of the more important wrinkles, placing the eye, using line work to suggest form and motion. That is the focus right now. And with my liner brush, I am being very light-handed with it. And when I do those marks across the elephant, I'm doing it very quickly. That keeps the line confident, because if I were to do it slowly, it would probably start to get shaky, and that would be far more noticeable in a way that makes it look like a mistake or like I didn't really know what I was doing. And I don't want that. Now here, on certain parts of the trunk, those wrinkles are thicker, and so then I move my brush more to the side to get a thicker line. And I do take those a little more slowly. But I'm not worried, I'm pretty confident. And on elephants, even though they do have those strong horizontal wrinkles on the trunk, there are a lot of vertical ones too. Now, because I like to paint loosely and atmospheric, imaginative, dreamy, I don't want to put in all those details. Let's face it, I have the attention span of a rodent. So I like to paint freely, quickly, because I always want to move on to the next thing because I'm having fun. So I'm going in with some really strong red on that side to create some shadow, but like I pointed out before, not all of the shadows have to be in a dark color, so I'm using red for this. Now, these paints that I've used lift really easily, especially Bloodstone Genuine, because it is granulating. But on hot press paper, it's usually easier to lift paint. So even though my paper was completely dry and I went on top of it, because I went so wet, there are some parts that actually start to lift where I didn't intend it to. And if that happens to you, don't panic. If you start to panic and try to fix it, you'll just end up lifting things more or calling more attention to that area, which will, again, like, you don't want to draw attention to quote unquote mistakes. Now, who knows, maybe it'll actually create a really cool texture that you can incorporate into your piece. But in the event that that happens, I would recommend, if you have a bead of water, go ahead and lightly dab it with the corner of a paper towel, and then let the area dry. Just leave it alone, because if you go in and try and fix it, you're just going to move things around more. Let it dry and then reassess. Now I'm putting in the top of the ears, and I'm using a lot of the red. I don't use red very often, and honestly, as far as sales go, red is a great eye catcher, but it doesn't go with decor as much as like blues and greens do. So when planning a show, having a lot of blues and greens is great for selling, but having some pieces that are red, one, it's going to be pretty different, so it's going to be eye-catching. Now, hopefully you've got someone out there that's brave and eclectic and wants to buy the big, powerful red piece. But if nothing else, it'll draw attention to your area, and even if maybe they don't buy the red piece, it got them over there, and then they might pick out one of your blue or green ones. That's a little more in my case, and what I've heard from other artists. Your results may and likely will vary. I can only speak for what's worked for me. Another little layer of advice, is don't be afraid to go really dark and thick with your pigment. Having that contrast brings attention to an area, and again, painting, as much as it's about fun, it's also about confidence. Go ahead and put down those bold brush strokes, which is also something I have to tell myself often. I usually stray away from hard lines, just because I love how soft things look in watercolor. But a combination of hard and soft, lost and found, that makes things very interesting. So it's a little hard for me sometimes to paint in some of these wrinkles because they are definite lines and they're hard lines, and I do of course end up going in and softening some of them because I do like things to be soft, but if it's too soft, then it's like I never painted it to begin with, an area gets muddy, and then, well, what was the point? And notice that even now my paper is still wet in areas I've already painted. I know that in watercolor it's said that you have to work quickly, and depending on what you're doing, yes, I guess, but don't rush. Things will stay workable for a while, actually, to the point where it almost gets frustrating because then I have to step away and let things dry, because with my technique, I need things to dry naturally. So I picked up some of the red fuchsite genuine, and this elephant has tusks. And so I'm drawing it in using that red fuchsite genuine, even though that's not where it's going to stay forever. I mean, it is, but like the tusk is going to go in front of the trunk, right? But I can't really do that very well in watercolor because watercolor is a subtractive art style. You are taking away the light. So in order to get light back, you either have to scrub the paper and lift it, but certain paints are very staining, like the quinacridone gold, so I'll probably never get the white of the paper. But I'm not a watercolor purist, so I have no problem with going on top of areas of my painting using some opaque water media to reclaim my whites, especially because elephant tusks have that texture and they're so unique that using a different medium to almost draw more attention to them, I like that. But right now I'm just using the watercolor to place it so that later when I do go add what I want to add on top, I know where to put it. So even though I don't sketch first, that kind of is a version of sketching something out first. I just sketched it with red fuchsite genuine and a paintbrush. And of course, watercolor dries paler, so there are areas that I had made dark before, and then as the painting dried, it became paler than I wanted it to be, so then I just have to go in again. Just be careful of your water content. Since I'm doing quite a few layers, and some of these paints like to shift, make sure to really need to know your pigments. Maybe your pigments don't have this issue because you're using something else, but for my pigments that I've used for this painting, I need to make sure that my pigment content on my brush is higher than my water content. So I think that's like, I don't know, they say like heavy cream consistency. So I've also used some hard lines to define the top of the elephant's head and ear. I don't want to outline the whole elephant because I think that's boring, but it was just a little too loose. So adding in a few broken lines and only more on the left side gives more information to the viewer of, okay, here's where it stops. And so then when they move over to the right side, which is far more abstract and in shadow, their brain can fill in the information. Trust your viewers, they're smart. They're creative too. All right, now that all of that has dried, I've gone in with my like teeny tiny liner brush and I am painting in more of those wrinkles because sometimes they catch the light, and having that little bit of gouache on top, I don't know, I just really like it. Add some shine. But I want to be careful not to put it everywhere and go overboard, because if everywhere's special, then nowhere's special. I'm putting in the eyelashes because that was one part of the elephant's eye that I thought was really interesting, that you could see how long and thick those lashes were. So I went in with my gouache, and it's a bit of a dry brush so that it feathers out at the end, really giving it that look of hair. But then I went in and picked up more gouache that was a little more wet. See, even with your more opaque medium like gouache, your water content on your brush versus pigment is important for how it's being applied. Because I don't want this to fade, and I want it to go on really thick. I do want it to be a thicker consistency on my brush, but if it's too thick, it won't move. So it just takes practice. Another one of those, get in your brush miles and get to know your material. I do recommend a synthetic brush though. It's easier for water control, and with gouache, I don't like to have a whole lot of water on my brush. So when I work with gouache, I will use synthetics. All right, so I want those tusks to really stand out. So I have some Daniel Smith watercolor ground. This is just the titanium white. And I've mixed it with my palette knife, and I'm grabbing a brush. And because this is watercolor ground, I'm using a really old small brush that I have. One of the first brushes I ever bought. And I'm applying it like I would paint. But whenever you're done, if you do use a paintbrush, I do recommend using an older one and really wash it out when you're done. The watercolor ground is a surface prep. So if I were to paint on like wood or a canvas, I would put this watercolor ground on in a couple coats, and then it doesn't completely mimic watercolor paper, but it does allow watercolor to be painted on a different surface. But I like to use it to bring opacity and white back into a piece, but also give it texture. Because I'm painting these on in brush strokes, those strokes, that texture, it remains on the tusk. And I like that. It's a really cool way to add a tiny bit of three-dimensionality, but without it being overwhelming. With using the ground, however, you have to let it dry naturally, and it takes like a day. So if you need to turn in something very soon, stick with gouache. You can blow dry that. But anyway, here's the finished painting. If you liked this video, press that like button so I know to make more like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe, because I make videos every Monday and Thursday. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye!